The judges deliberated for 16 hours. The cardinal belonged to one of the greatest noble families in France. He was innocent, the judges ruled, without a stain upon his character. The queen could not hide her sorrow. Although she was innocent, poisonous rumors had denounced her as the guilty party, who had coveted the necklace and had urged the cardinal to buy it for her. She wrote a friend,
"Come and weep with me. The judgment that has just been pronounced is an atrocious insult. I am bathed in tears of grief and despair."
This is really the story of a woman who has to grow up very fast, and she does so in fits and starts. There are various moments in her career where there is an incredible sobering up and wising up, and the aftermath of the affaire du collier, the diamond necklace affair, is one of those moments.
Marie Antoinette had been blameless, but the verdict was a ringing denunciation of her way of life.
I think the diamond necklace affair was made possible because Marie Antoinette was already seen as somebody who would do anything to get a new diamond. It's because Marie Antoinette was seen as a frivolous woman that the necklace affair could exist. The diamond necklace affair was a turning point for Marie Antoinette. She was condemned at that time, and she was condemned forever.
Marie Antoinette was becoming the most hated woman in France. The humiliating affair of the necklace fired the pens of scandal-mongering journalists, eager to satisfy the lascivious fantasies of a public convinced that the queen would do anything to gratify her perverse desires.
Tout est imaginable et tout va être imaginé par les pamphlétaires. L'homosexualité de la reine, sa manière d'aller chercher le plaisir chez d'innombrables amants. La reine est non seulement celle qui ne satisfait pas son mari, mais qui en même temps est prise de fureur utérine. C'est un peu le terme consacré par un pamphlet contre la reine Marie-Antoinette. Ces images sont absolument désastreuses pour l'image de la reine. L'image caractéristique du couple royal, c'est donc le roi Louis XVI qui n'arrive pas à avoir une érection. L'attaque d'impuissance contre le roi est aussi une attaque politique, puisque être impuissant pour un roi, c'est non seulement une attaque sur le corps du roi, mais c'est aussi une attaque sur la volonté politique. L'impuissance de Louis XVI, c'est aussi l'homme qui ne fait rien, l'homme qui ne sait pas prendre une décision, l'homme qui hésite. Un roi qui est incapable de gouverner sa femme est évidemment incapable de gouverner le pays.
While the pamphlets were linking sexual failure with political inadequacy, the king was beset by unremitting financial problems, which neither he nor his advisors could solve. France was nearly bankrupt, and the Austrian queen, Madame Deficit, continued to absorb the blame.
What do they want of me? What harm have I done them?
The chorus of lies and hatred in the popular press grew more and more strident, assailing the queen as the cause of France's trouble by coupling sexual degeneration with moral and political corruption.
Marie Antoinette became the scapegoat. Everything which was going wrong, and there were many things, it was her fault. It was her responsibility. But it's all a question about images. It's a game with images. This new powerful thing, public opinion, was really beginning and was making a new world. She had no idea that something like that could exist.
La reine n'a pas bien compris qu'on est dans une guerre d'images. Et c'est sur ce terrain-là, la reine est absolument perdante.
Gradually, the Queen became aware that she would have to respond to the torrent of savage attacks. In 1787, she commissioned a portrait of herself, surrounded by her children, grouped together to suggest the Holy Family. She wore a pair of simple earrings, leaving her neck bare, without a necklace.
This is a classic example of damage containment. And you feel she understands the gravity of the situation.
At last, the Queen recognized the danger and put her frivolity behind her. She fired her private dressmaker, removed the gambling tables from her drawing rooms, cut back on personal expenses of every kind.
La reine change. La reine s'intéresse moins à sa vie de plaisir et se consacre beaucoup plus à la vie politique.
The authority of the king was crumbling. While Louis and his ministers talked of financial reforms, the people were hungry.
This is economically one of the very worst years. There's been another terrible winter. People are really hungry. You know, it's a catastrophic situation, really.
The king was in despair. He was hunting, one observer reported, to excess and indulging in immoderate meals. That spring, he was seen each day in the Queen's apartments, weeping.
He did not respond well under pressure, and in 1787 he really had what we would call a nervous breakdown. Marie Antoinette realized, for the sake of her son's future, her children's future, for the sake of the monarchy in which she believed, she'd been brought up to believe in it, she had to be the strong one.
The Queen began attending meetings of the King's Council. Her Majesty now seems entirely occupied with discussions of economies and reforms, a foreign ambassador wrote. But all these affairs are treated without any method or prearranged plan, and the result is a confusion which aggravates the evil instead of lessening it.
C'est une femme qui est totalement dépourvue de culture politique, qui n'a aucune expérience, qui connaît mal l'histoire de la France, qui ne connaît pas les réalités de ce pays. Et elle s'aliénait un certain nombre de personnes à la cour qui voyaient qu'elle défendait plus les intérêts de l'Autriche que les intérêts de la France. On avait l'impression qu'elle se conduisait beaucoup plus en archiduchesse autrichienne que comme une reine de France.
In 1789, with some of France's most powerful nobles agitating for reform, the king reluctantly convened the Estates General for the first time in more than a century. The Estates General was a form of parliament dating back to medieval times, representing the three estates: the nobility, the clergy, and the common people.
What fatal news. I dread it. These gentlemen wish to restrain the power of the king, but they will bring on their own destruction.
Neither Marie Antoinette nor her husband could imagine sharing power.
Elle a sa conception du pouvoir royal qui doit être absolu et immuable. Le roi et la reine ont été absolument atterré parce qu'il ne voulait pas qu'il y ait partage entre des élus et un pouvoir exécutif qui était celui du roi.
Just as the king and the queen should be concentrating on how to work some kind of future with the politicians, their eldest son, the Dauphin Louis Joseph, the beloved, started to die very painfully of tubercular fever, which meant he became all twisted. He suffered.
2 years before, the Queen had lost her baby girl. Now, while she sat helplessly at her son's bedside, the 7-year-old boy died. Overcome with grief, the Queen was deeply wounded by the response of her subjects.
At the death of my poor little prince, the nation hardly seemed to notice.
The King and Queen had little time to mourn their son. The deputies to the Third Estate had declared themselves a national assembly. They were intent on providing a constitution for France and abolishing aristocratic privileges. The Queen called the National Assembly a pack of madmen.
France is absolutely alive with politicians who are trying to bring into being a constitutional monarchy. Politician after politician are producing schemes and trying their fervent best to make sure that the King and Queen are on board, and on board genuinely. The King and the Queen have a real decision to make, and they have no playbook. Is it better to limit the damage to the sovereign authority of the traditional absolute monarchy in France by accepting a role of a constitutional monarch? The King is in two minds, the Queen is in one mind. She and her circle are essentially committed to a coup d'etat against the National Assembly. And that is the Rubicon, really. I mean, she persuades the King, or certainly if the King had been wobbling about it, she, puts backbone into him to move troops in huge numbers between Versailles and Paris. And it's this sort of sense that really Paris itself is about to be subject to a military occupation. The National Assembly is about to be liquidated. That creates the atmosphere for July the 14th.
On July 14, 1789, the rituals of everyday life in Versailles marked the hours just as they always had. Paris was only 10 miles away, but the King and Queen did not know that an angry mob was storming through the city streets, that the much-hated prison fortress in the heart of the city called the Bastille had fallen. Versailles was calm. At 10, the King went to bed, as was his habit, and by the strict dictates of decorum, he was not to be awakened until the next day. But at 2 in the morning, he was suddenly thrust from sleep by the Grand Master of the Wardrobe. "The Bastille has been taken," the King was told. "The governor has been assassinated. His head is being borne on a pike through the town." "Is it a revolt?" the King asked. "No, sire," came the reply. "It is a revolution."
In Versailles, nobody could believe it. It was such a shock. It was a complete panic. Within few days, everything collapsed. Most of the people around the King and the Queen left. And Marie Antoinette wanted to leave. She wanted to escape.
The Queen urged the King to flee to a provincial capital near the Austrian border. But when the King refused, she resolved to remain by his side. The Queen wrote to a friend,
I am shaken by this succession of blows. We are surrounded by hardships and misfortunes, but you may be sure that adversity has not lessened my strength or my courage.
Within weeks, the social order that had endured for centuries fractured. Aristocrats and clergy were stripped of centuries-old feudal privileges. The press was declared free, serfdom abolished, the rights of man proclaimed. With the royal censors gone, a flood of still more hateful pamphlets further blackened the Queen's reputation.
La Révolution fait payer à Marie-Antoinette ses prises de position contre-révolutionnaires et elle fait payer d'une certaine manière cette grande peur qu'il y a eu de la prise du pouvoir par une femme. Cette idée qu'une sorte de volonté de pouvoir chez Marie-Antoinette qui serait non moins qu'une volonté de pouvoir politique, de gouverner à la place de son mari. Il y a une grande peur de la pouvoir de la femme chez Marie-Antoinette.
There was a very ugly streak of misogyny going on too, feeding into this mad demonology about dangerously meddling, sexually voracious women.
Some pamphlets are really astonishing. It's like open dreams. It's a world of dark fantasy, full of hatred. And there is a link, a sort of red thread, which goes from the first attacks against the Queen to the end.
The King and Queen were at the mercy of events which had moved beyond their control. Less than 3 months after the fall of the Bastille, a mob led by thousands of women marched toward Versailles demanding bread. The Queen was wandering in her garden at the Petit Trianon. The King had chosen to go hunting once again. Armed with broom handles, old pistols, pitchforks, and kitchen knives, the women surged forward, cursing the Queen. "I should like to open her belly with a knife and tear out her heart," cried one. And another, "I shall have a thigh." And yet another, "I shall have the entrails." Early the next morning, the mob broke into the palace, killed 2 of the royal bodyguards, and forced open the door to the Queen's bedroom. Just moments before, the Queen had fled through a secret passageway to the safety of her husband's rooms. In a fury, the mob, screaming for the death of the Queen, drove their pikes through her bed.
To violate the privacy and the sanctity of the Queen's own boudoir, it's like being raped. It is absolutely like being raped. Nothing prepares the King and Queen for the physical invasion of the palace. The fate of the polity and the physical, personal fate of her own family have become one.
The King and Queen were prisoners of the mob. That afternoon, the royal family was forced to leave the palace. As the gates swung shut behind them, they turned and looked at Versailles for the last time.
We are lost, dragged away, perhaps to death. When kings become prisoners, they are very near it.
The royal family was taken to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. where they were placed under heavy guard, captive in everything but name.
La reine avait manqué d'être assassinée et c'est une femme qui est complètement fragilisée et qui réagit de façon un peu hystérique au moindre choc. Marie-Antoinette, à partir de ce moment-là, va vivre dans l'angoisse et dans la peur physique. Mais ça ne l'empêche pas de faire preuve de courage.
She's getting tougher by the day. She's personally very brave. I mean, she's crying out, but you and I would be, I'd be crying. And the more awful life gets for her, the more steely she is.
The Queen began to work on large pieces of tapestry, her lady-in-waiting wrote. Her mind too much occupied with surrounding dangers. The needle was the only employment which could divert her. The sole topic of her discourse was the revolution. She sought to discover the real opinions the Parisians had of her, and how she could have so completely lost the affections of the people.
Her political savvy, her political acumen, her political determination grows exponentially with the catastrophic nature of the decisions being taken. The more she's between a rock and a hard place, the more determined she is now to be a queen. All those years when she could have been a queen, she was the airhead in the pretty dress, taking it on the chin unfairly for all these, scandals and absurdities. When she decides to become a queen, she decides to be the wrong kind of queen, really. And boy, does she go for it.
With the king sunk into a profound torpor, the Queen committed herself to a desperate struggle against the revolution. She took secret counsel with ambassadors and advisors, even learning to read and write in code to communicate with allies in other countries.
The king, one of the revolutionaries said, has only one man on whom he can depend: his wife.
She was decisive where he was indecisive. She was courageous when he was vacillating. She wasn't educated. She found it very difficult to write long letters. Nevertheless, she stayed up all night writing letters to her brother in Austria, writing letters to people, trying to hold the show together. Her whole character begins to deepen. She felt a deep melancholy, an agony about what might happen. Suffering taught her. She began to understand what sort of person she really was.
For most of her life, Marie Antoinette had wasted her energies on parties and balls, the races and gambling tables. Now, 34 years old, she contemplated her tragic destiny.
As far as we are personally concerned, happiness is over and done with, whatever the course of events may be. If only what we are now suffering could be counted on to make our children happy. Tribulation first makes you realize who you are.
In her darkest hours, Marie Antoinette turned for comfort to her old friend Axel Fersen, who secretly visited the palace in spite of the danger to himself.
She is extremely unhappy, but very brave, Fersen wrote. I try to console her as best I can. I live only to serve her.
Fersen feared for the Queen's life. There seemed to be only one hope: escape. Late on the night of June 20th, 1791, what appeared to be an ordinary family slipped into a hackney cab not far from the Tuileries Palace. Closer inspection would have meant disaster for the little group. The royal family was in flight. The king had been paralyzed by indecision. The Queen masterminded the escape herself.
Our position is horrible. I have trusted in time and in the hope that public opinion may change. But today, everything is different. If we would escape destruction, we must take the only path open to us. If we must perish, let us do so gloriously.
Driving the cab was Axel Fersen, who helped plan the escape.
As long as he was in charge, there was skill. But the king told him to go away because Count Fersen was a foreigner, and he didn't want people to think a foreigner had helped them get away.
At first, the scheme went smoothly enough. Once outside Paris, the family switched coaches and drivers and headed toward the Austrian border, where loyal troops were waiting for them. Backed by the Austrian Empire, the king and queen were prepared to retake France from the revolutionaries by force. But first, they would have to travel nearly 200 miles without being recognized, and they were moving too slowly, making themselves too conspicuous. The king and queen traveled the only way they knew how, in a brand new carriage, a luxury vehicle with racks for the king's favorite wines and built-in compartments for the royal robes and the king's crown. There was a silver dinner service, a clothes press, and a chamber pot with a leather cover. The escape was destined to fail, doomed by royal etiquette.
A king just cannot fly away. It's difficult to imagine how strong, how powerful the etiquette was. It was like a magic circle around these people, and they could not get out.
After more than 22 hours on the road, they were at last approaching Austria. Just 40 miles and they would be across the border. When they were spotted by a former cavalryman. They were apprehended in a little town called Varennes, seized by citizens loyal to the revolution, and forced to return to Paris. For nearly 4 days, they traveled at a walking pace, with their once loyal subjects jeering and insulting them all along the way. The mystique of the inviolable monarch had shattered beyond repair.
What a king was, and what a queen was someone whose body you were not proximate to. You couldn't scream at them, you couldn't spit at them, you couldn't wave pikes under their face. You know, what kind of king and queen could there possibly be to whom that would be allowed to happen?
L'effet de Varennes est un événement qui accentue encore la crise du couple royal dans l'opinion. Dès lors, l'image du roi partout dans les pamphlets, dans les caricatures, c'est celle du cochon. C'est celle du roi porc, du roi cochon. Le cochon étant un animal coupé, impuissant, castré, et aussi l'animal qui ne pense qu'à manger. Pour la reine, elle qui a le rôle moteur dans le couple, elle réussit à convaincre son mari qui était très hésitant, et donc cela contribue à l'image contre-révolutionnaire de Marie-Antoinette. Et l'image aussi de l'étrangère, puisque la fuite, c'était quoi? C'était pour rejoindre les armées étrangères.
La reine devient une femme qui est avide du sang du peuple. Vous voyez, il y a cette espèce de crescendo et il faut que la reine soit considérée comme un monstre.
The Queen bore the blame for the aborted escape. Marie Antoinette was so despised, the English ambassador reported, that if she had walked out on the streets of Paris, she would have been torn to pieces. With the king and queen back in the Tuileries Palace under much heavier guard, on September 19, 1791, crowds of Parisians turned out to celebrate a new constitution.
France was now a constitutional monarchy,
With the power of the king severely restricted. Marie Antoinette privately thought the Constitution was monstrous, a tissue of absurdities. But she swallowed her pride and urged the king to accept it.
It is impossible for the king to refuse his consent. What good can there be in exposing oneself to certain and needless peril?
The perils were everywhere. The revolution was far from over. The attempted escape had given ammunition to the revolutionaries who wanted to abolish the monarchy, to be rid of king and queen altogether. At the same time, war fever was growing. Many revolutionaries were clamoring to protect the new government by attacking its enemies and spreading the ideals of the revolution abroad. Their target? France's longtime rival, the country where Marie Antoinette had been born, Austria.
In spite of the risks, the Queen clung to the hope that war would bring her former countrymen to her rescue.
The Queen wants a war. She feels herself to be a prisoner, she's scared. She's determined to bring on the soldiers to get her out of this nightmare.
In the spring of 1792, the king declared war on Austria, then fell into a despondent state, a court attendant wrote, which amounted almost to physical helplessness. He passed 10 successive days without uttering a single word, even in the bosom of his family.
He fears to give orders, but the king is not a coward. He has great passive courage. He is crushed by an over-tender conscience. As for myself, I would like to act, on horseback if necessary. But if I acted so, it would give weapons to the king's enemies. The outcry against the Austrian woman, against the domination of a female, would be general in France. In showing myself, I would destroy the king.
At the end of April, French soldiers headed into battle in the name of universal liberty. Austrian troops struck back, forcing the French to retreat. The war would last for 23 years and leave 1.5 million Frenchmen dead. The Queen was on the side of France's enemies. From her rooms in the Tuileries Palace, she wrote letter after letter to her nephew, the Emperor of Austria, sending detailed accounts of French military plans whenever she could lay her hands on them.
Every time she learns anything about the disposition of French troops, she dials 1-800-Vienna, you know. It actually goes straight to the enemy. Whoa, excuse me, you know, serious gamble. Her role is not complicated from now on. She wants France to be defeated.
Il y avait bien sûr trahison de sa part. Il s'agissait avant tout de sauver la monarchie, quoi qu'il dût en coûter.
Amidst the furies of war and revolution, Marie Antoinette turned for solace to her children.
If I could be happy, I should be made happy by these two little beings. My children are my sole resource, and I have them with me as much as possible.
She watched over her 7-year-old son anxiously, writing to his governess,
Our affection for him must not lack an element of severity. We must not forget that we are bringing him up to be a king.
With war fueling a violent patriotic fervor, the radicals who wanted to put an end to the monarchy began taking control of the revolution. On June 20th, a mob invaded the palace and forced onto the king's head the red cap of independence.
The king was forced to drink the health of the revolution. They have lost all scraps and shreds of their royal dignity.
The end of the monarchy itself was at hand.
Less than 3 months later, an armed mob, 20,000 strong, stormed the palace.
The king and queen had little choice but to submit. As they were led out of the palace, Louis was heard to say, "The leaves are falling early this year." On September 21st, 1792, the King and Queen of France became nothing more than ordinary citizens of the new French Republic. The monarchy, which had endured for nearly 1,000 years, was no more.
Marie Antoinette had always been terrified by the medieval tower in the middle of Paris, a gloomy fortress called the Temple, with narrow windows and an inner courtyard that never saw the sun. 3 days after they were taken from the palace, she and her family were imprisoned there.
They were kept in strict confinement, no court. Just the parents teaching the children. It became a sort of little bourgeois household for a few months.
They were provided with rooms refurbished to make them more comfortable. A generous supply of food catered by a staff of 13, and a library for the king. There was even a harpsichord, so that Marie Antoinette could give lessons to her daughter.
C'est une vie en point de suspension, avec des promenades au pied de la tour du Temple, où le petit dauphin jouait au ballon. La reine faisait de la broderie, faisait de la couture, faisait du tricot. Le roi et la reine, le soir, jouaient eux-mêmes au billard.
Everything is about family now. The one thing that they always accused her of not being a good mother, a good wife, a sort of bourgeoise, kind of decent person, she now overwhelmingly is.
In August 1792, a guillotine was erected in the center of Paris, a new, humane form of execution.
The mechanism falls like thunder, its inventor Dr. Guillotin reported. The head flies off, blood spurts. The man is no more. In their rooms in the tower, the royal family, the king and queen, their 2 children, and the king's sister, quietly waited, while fear was rising all around them. The fledgling French Republic was fighting for its life. Prussia had allied itself with Austria and invaded France, routing French armies. French peasants who opposed the revolution threatened civil war. The military crisis in the countryside provoked a violent reaction in the capital. On August 21st, 1792, the guillotine began meting out justice to France's suspected enemies.
A week later, the royal family was disturbed by cries outside the prison walls. A mob was on the rampage, invading the city's prisons.
A great many of their royalist friends were massacred in the most horrible way, in a kind of bloodbath. Marie Antoinette's favourite, the Princesse de Lamballe, was dragged out of her cell, executed, and her hair was then dressed by a barber, her beautiful hair. Her head was put on a pike and it was dangled outside the window of Marie Antoinette at the temple.
The crowd demanded that the Queen kiss her friend's pale lips. Frozen with horror, Marie Antoinette fainted.
3 months later, the king was charged with treason and put on trial.
The king is tried and he's sentenced to death. He's allowed to say goodbye to his wife and children, a terribly painful scene. He pretends he'll see them in the morning in order to get rid of them because he wants to pray. And do you know what he does? He eats a large dinner and sleeps a good night's sleep. Isn't that odd?
I commend my children to my wife, the king wrote in his will. I beg her to forgive me all the evil she is suffering for my sake, and the grief I may have caused her during the course of our marriage. At 10:30 in the morning, January 21st, 1793, the sound of rolling drums announced to the Queen that her husband was dead. After more than 20 years of marriage, they had grown truly fond of one another. All that remained to her now were her 2 children, and she clung to them with all the desperation of a mother's love. Her 8-year-old son had become, for those who still believed in the monarchy, the King of France, Louis XVII. When she was presented with a plan to escape alone, she refused to consider leaving him behind.
The interests of my son are the only guide I have. And whatever happiness I could achieve by being free of this place, I cannot consent to separate myself from him.
"5 months after her husband's execution, with no warning, her son was taken from her and imprisoned in another part of the tower.
The next cruel step on the pilgrimage was taking away the little boy. She could hear him crying all night in a different part of the tower from her. The poor little boy was filled with drink and beaten. It was appalling abuse.
Forbidden to visit her child, Marie Antoinette would stand for hours in front of the narrow window slits in her cell, hoping to glimpse him in the courtyard. Sometimes, she would hear him singing songs of the Revolution, which his jailer made him learn. One month later, Marie Antoinette was herself removed from her cell and imprisoned in a fortress along the River Seine. The Conciergerie, a medieval relic, dark, damp, with thick walls and windows barred with iron. The former queen, who had spent her life in splendid palaces with countless rooms, was now confined to a single squalid cell.
Elle est enfermée dans une chambre qui est pratiquement sans jour. Il n'y a qu'une petite fenêtre. Et le concierge arrondit ses fins de mois en faisant payer des gens pour voir la dernière reine de France.
She was 37, a shadow of her former self, hardly a threat to anyone.
But from the moment she entered the conciergerie, her life was forfeit. "I have promised the head of Antoinette," a revolutionary leader warned. "I will go and cut it off myself if there is any delay in giving it to me." All of Europe was aligning itself against France. Britain and Spain had joined Austria and Prussia. And in France itself, civil war was now spreading, threatening to tear the new republic apart. With fear the order of the day, a new revolutionary tribunal had been formed to prosecute enemies of the state. Marie Antoinette was ripe for sacrifice.
Nobody expected the revolutionaries to kill Marie Antoinette. Why kill a queen consort? Marie Antoinette was deliberately targeted in order to bind the French together in a kind of blood bond.
The trial began on October 14th, 1793. The indictment was riddled with language that seemed to draw directly on the pamphlets and popular press. She was a scourge and a bloodsucker, it read, given to intrigues of every kind, disordered pleasures, excessive squandering, perfidious views.
It was a show trial. She was only allowed to meet her own advocate the night before, and he wasn't allowed to do anything for her anyway. They'd already decided to kill her, but she didn't know that.
Never for one moment have you ceased wanting to destroy liberty. You wanted to regain the throne at any price, over the bodies of patriots.
We had no need to remount the throne. We were already on it.
What interest do you attach to the aims of the Republic?
The happiness of France is what I desire above all things.
Do you think that kings are necessary to ensure the happiness of nations?
An individual cannot decide such a question.
You surely regret that your son has lost a throne on which he might have been seated had it not been for the uprising of the people.
I shall never regret anything for my son, as long as my country is happy.
She did extremely well. She was so intelligent at the trial. It really demonstrates how far she had come. Can you imagine the 14-year-old Marie Antoinette being able to score off these advocates?
On trial for her life, there seemed to be only one charge Marie Antoinette had to fear: treason.
Since the revolution, you have never for a moment ceased intriguing with foreign powers against liberty.
Since the revolution, I personally have forbidden myself all correspondence abroad.
Il n'y avait aucune pièce prouvant sa trahison. On a trouvé dans les archives un certain nombre de lettres de la reine qui prouvent réellement sa trahison. Mais à l'époque, on ne le savait absolument pas.
Witness followed witness, 41 in all, giving testimony that had little bearing on the case. Her intrigues with foreign powers were not the real issue. Her reputation was.
She is immoral in every way, so perverted and so familiar with every crime that, forgetting her position as a mother and the line drawn by the laws of nature, she did not recoil from indulging with her son in indecencies the mere idea and mention of which arouse a shudder of horror.
They laid the most disgusting charge against her. It was so gross, and it was intended to be gross. They wanted to smirch her reputation as a mother, which was very important to her, and the idea of the mother of France was very important to the country.
From a declaration that the boy made, it was revealed that these two women often made him lie down between them. That there then took place acts of the most uncontrolled debauchery. That there was no doubt, from what her son said, that there had been an act of incest between the mother and son.
Marie Antoinette and her sister-in-law were accused of molesting the Queen's son. But there was no substance to the charge. The only evidence, the testimony of the little boy, a terrified 8-year-old torn from the arms of his mother and threatened and abused by his jailers.
It's as though someone would prosecute the president, let's say in an impeachment case, and would take really as a basic script the National Enquirer.
Son procès est la synthèse de ce qu'il y a dans les pamphlets à ce moment-là depuis presque une dizaine d'années. C'est-à-dire le rôle à la fois politique et sexuel de la reine. C'est ça qui est l'aboutissement de l'image publique de la reine.
As the prosecutor's words reverberated across a courtroom, suddenly grown deathly quiet, Marie Antoinette sat in stony silence. Until a juror asked her why she did not respond to the charge.
If I have made no reply, it is because nature refuses to answer such a charge brought against her mother. I appeal in this matter to all the mothers present in the court.
A wave of sympathy rippled through the room. Some of the women cried out to stop the trial. The prosecutor pressed the incest charge no further. In the court record, it was noted that the accused appeared deeply moved. The trial went on for 2 days and a night. When the verdict came, it was 4 in the morning. Marie Antoinette was sentenced to be executed at noon that same day. Throughout the trial, she had demonstrated a calm intelligence and fierce will. Now, with only hours to live, Marie Antoinette prepared for her final ordeal. Weak and exhausted, she summoned her remaining strength to write her sister-in-law.
October 16th, 4:30 in the morning. I have just been condemned to death, but not to a shameful one, since this death is shameful only to criminals. I am calm, as people are, whose conscience is clear. I know how much my little boy must have made you suffer. Forgive him, my dear sister. Remember how young he is, and how easy it is to make a child say whatever one wants, to put words he does not understand into his mouth. I send you my heartfelt love, and also to my poor, dear children. How heartbreaking it is to leave them forever. Adieu. Adieu.
The letter ends abruptly. It was never sent. As the tumbril made its way across Paris, the horses walked slowly. Marie Antoinette, one revolutionary said, should drink long of death. 30,000 soldiers stood guard. Mobs lined the streets, hurling insults. The whore, one newspaper reported, was audacious and insolent to the very end.
Her dignity was so great that when she was taken in this rough cart, no carriage for her, to the place of execution, the newspapers dared not write afterwards that she'd been cowardly, that she'd shrieked and cried, as they liked writing about aristocrats. They had to say that she'd been dignified. So they said it was the pride of a habitual criminal.
Il y a un crayon de David qui montre une très vieille femme que l'on conduit à la guillotine avec un courage extraordinaire et une dignité incroyable.
She showed no sign of fear. Some people achieve miracles of decent self-control and composure.
At that moment, which must be an incredible moment of panic, she still reflects perfect form. She climbed the stairs to the guillotine very lightly, without a pause. A sort of natural heroism. She did die as a queen.
It was noon. With the blade suspended above her, Marie Antoinette moved forward and accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot.
Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose.
Marie Antoinette's severed head was held high before a screaming crowd. She was buried in an unmarked grave.
Ce qui la place véritablement dans la légende, c'est cette mort affreuse. Il y a mythe parce que c'était une femme frivole qui s'est transformée bien malgré elle et parce que sa vie s'est achevée par une abominable tragédie.
She's gone on a very long journey through hell and back. And with each defeat and each disaster, behave with transcendent courage. But as a queen, she is a catastrophe because she makes a constitutional monarchy impossible. A relatively peaceful transition from an old world of an absolute monarchy to a new world of a constitutional monarchy is screwed. That door is closed. All of our own natural, humane response to her being someone who behaves with a growing sense of tragic intelligence does not compensate. It's a tragedy for France, but it's also, in a Greek sense, of tragedy being no way out, of playing out your destiny. It is indeed deeply a personal tragedy.
It's a story which goes between two extremes. She was a girl whose destiny is the happiest possible destiny. All she wanted and all she created was made from flowers and sounds. It's a vanishing kingdom. By the end, everything she had is taken away from her. Everything and everybody she loved.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.